Hi, I'm Terrence Donahue, the Corporate Director of Learning at Emerson. With me today is Dr. Michael Watkins, co-founder of Genesis Advisors and author of the international bestseller, The First 90 Days. Michael, thank you for joining us today, and welcome to Emerson.
Glad to be here, Terrence.
Now, Michael, we've partnered with you to create an Emerson-specific version of your workshop that's based on the first 90 days. We call it Successful Leadership Transitions, Taking Charge in Your New Leadership Role. Michael, I'd also like to congratulate you on the recent recognition that Amazon's given to your book, The First 90 Days. I understand that they've recognized it as one of the top 100 business books of all time. That's no small accomplishment. Congratulations.
Thanks very much. I was actually very surprised, but very gratified.
Michael, let's start by discussing why was this workshop created?
I was working with ideas around accelerating leaders taking new roles, and I began working with a healthcare company that wanted to experiment with the ideas. And so I created a first version of the workshop. And it was really from that workshop that a lot of the key ideas and concepts like the STARS framework emerged. And of course, then I wrote the book, but the workshop still really does something that the book doesn't. You know, getting into the classroom with participants, having them apply the concepts, work through some exercises, talk to peers, really, I think, deepens their understanding of what they need to do to be successful in a transition.
What opportunities are companies trying to create or problems are they trying to solve through the first 90 days approach?
If you look at what's going on in a typical company, we did some research on this, you find that about a quarter of the leaders in a large, Fortune 500 company are taking new roles every year. That's a tremendous amount of normal transition, right? And it has a very large impact on the organization. I sometimes ask questions of participants in workshops I'm teaching about, are you in transition personally? Well, for many of them, they of course are, or they wouldn't be there. But also they have a boss in transition, or a peer in transition, or a direct report in transition. And so if you take people in organizations, almost everybody is being impacted at some point in time, at any given point of time, by somebody's transition. And if you think about the overall sort of systematic impact of transition on organizations, it's very large. And if you can just speed those transitions up by a little bit, it can have a tremendous impact on performance, nimbleness, responsiveness in the marketplace. And that's really why organizations, have focused on using these ideas.
Our Successful Leadership Transitions workshop is now a component in several of our world area leadership development programs, but we're also offering it as a nomination-based open enrollment type of session. How do you see other companies using your workshop?
Our experience has really been that once people experience the first 90 days and the workshop, it sort of sells itself, right? Because people come out of it energized with a plan. Transitions are challenging, right? Transitions are difficult. Transitions are very stressful times. And if you can help people put together, a consolidated sense of what they're up against, right, and a plan for moving forward, it can really reduce anxiety levels, it can spur innovation, it gets people very excited about going forward. So our experience has really been that organizations may decide to start to implement it in one way or another, but it very quickly takes hold and kind of takes on a life of its own. Obviously, there are differences, right? In terms of who is supporting it. Does it come from more of a center of excellence corporate core? Is it supported more by a business unit around a particular set of needs? We sometimes have organizations that have particularly intense transitions going on in parts of their organization. They've acquired something or there's a major restructuring going on. And in those situations, they may pick up this basic set of ideas and use it to speed up those transitions. And in other cases, they do it as you do, right, which is as part of the normal flow of, leadership capital through the organization and as a core part of the overall development process. And frankly, it's really wonderful to see the combination of development and transition. It's not as common as you might think, right? Lots of organizations do a decent job on the development piece, that is getting someone ready to go to the next level, but they don't necessarily do a great job with helping them actually make the transition. And it's really the combination of those two things that is so powerful.
So Successful Leadership Transitions focuses on what you call the 7 drivers of successful transitions. Could you briefly describe each one for us?
Sure. So first of all, it's important to have a framework, right, and a language and a set of tools to help people understand the different elements of transition. So creating the transition roadmap was really an effort to try and do that, to parse it into chunks that people could understand and apply that collectively would have the right impact in speeding up the transitions. The first, component is really accelerate your learning. I see learning as really foundational in the end. You've got a lot to learn. You've got to learn about the technical dimensions of your job, the cultural dimensions, the political dimensions. You can't just learn by immersing yourself and hoping that it's all going to, sort of seep through your pores and you'll figure it out. You've got to be systematic. There's so much going on. There's so much you need to do. You need to create a learning plan. You need to think about how you can speed up that learning process. So accelerate your learning is the first big element. Match your strategy to the situation. It became very obvious to me early on that the way you transition into a new role really depends a lot on the type of situation you've inherited or the mix. It's a very different thing to come into a turnaround environment where you need to act quickly, right? It's very action-oriented, it's immediate analysis and on with the show, as opposed to more of a realignment or sustaining success kind of environment where you need to immerse yourself more deeply, understand what's really going on, build alliances and coalitions to support, the change efforts that you need to be pursuing. And then the third element is really around gaining alignment. If learning is the alpha of transitions, then connection and alignment is the omega, right? You've got lots of directions around which you need to get alignment, right? With your boss, obviously, but also often with your peers, other key stakeholders. You've got to drive alignment with your team. So how do you make sure that everything lines up so that success is well defined, so that you know what it looks like, you know how you're going to achieve it? That's the third big element. I sort of think about those elements, the accelerate your learning, match strategy, situation, gain alignment, as in part at least diagnostic about figuring out the lay of the land and what you need to do. As you begin to do that, you can begin to establish direction. And establishing direction is about what you're going to do, but also critically what's your team and your organization going to do, right? And that's the what, it's the goals, right? It's the how, which is the strategy. But critically, it's also the why, right? Why should people get excited about going down this road with you? And then there's the elements of the transition roadmap that are more about implementation and acceleration and beginning to gain momentum. There's build your team, right? Typically, you're not going to get to build your team from scratch. You're going to inherit somebody else's team, your predecessors. There may even be members of the team that were your predecessors' people. You inherit those people, you've got to assess them, figure out whether they're the right people in the right roles. You've got to think about how to reshape that team. You've got to think about how to align that team powerfully in terms of direction and set of purpose, right? And you've got to figure out how to accelerate it down the road of, taking actions that are going to begin to create momentum. Then there's securing early wins. I'm a big believer in the power of early wins to begin to create perception, and perception is important, that good things are happening, right? So some early effort to identify what are those opportunities where you can begin to get some progress with modest investment of resource, but it's visible, it's tangible, people notice and they go, oh, good things are starting to happen here. We're making progress. And that sort of energy becomes almost, infectious, right? It begins to really mobilize people and they begin to want to get on board with where things are going. And then finally, in the midst of all this, you have to understand how to manage yourself. These are highly pressurized times. They can be times of great excitement. They can be times of great anxiety. Typically, they're both, only on different days, right? You're going to have days when things are going great, and you're going to be days when you're going to be banging your head against the wall going, why did I take this job? So understanding how to manage yourself through that process, stay in equilibrium, build the right set of advisors and counselors, relationships that can help sustain you, maintain your energy level through the whole thing. That's part of the kind of the care and feeding of you as a leader in transition.
Michael, since you've written the first edition of the first 90 days, has anything fundamentally changed in terms of how leaders approach transitions?
So I sometimes joke that it used to be the first 90 days and now it's the first 90 minutes. So I think that there's been a real acceleration of the pace of business, but also the expectations of people getting up to speed. That's made, the first 90 days ideas even more important than they were before, right? People are moving through jobs very quickly. Transitions are happening all the time. Sometimes it's the normal flow of people, but often it's the restructurings or changes that are driving people, into making more transitions than before. So the pace is certainly higher than it used to be. The time that you have to have an impact is lower, right? You're just, expectations, especially when you get to senior leadership levels, are such that you're going to get in and you're going to have an impact very, very quickly. So that's definitely changed things. Then I think, as with all things, digitalization and, remote work have profoundly changed the nature of leadership roles, and that's really reflected in what you need to do to be successful in a transition, right? It's the rare senior executive that is working with a co-located team these days, right? So what does that mean when you've got to transition into a new role and a good chunk of your team is sitting in multiple other places, right? How do you accelerate the learning process in a situation like that? So that's certainly been a very big impact overall.
Is there a way to quantify the cost, for example, the financial cost or the human element of a failed leadership transition?
So there have been many efforts to try and do this, and it's difficult, right? And it's difficult because it really varies dramatically by level. And it's also hard to quantify what a failure looks like, right? I mean, and let me give you examples of ways people have attempted to do it, right? It's easiest for leaders who are onboarding from the outside, right? Because basically one measure is, do they stay or do they go? And lots of studies have shown that if you're not using the right approach to integrate people coming in from the outside into your organization, you're going to typically see 40% failure rates in the first 18 months. It's pretty easy to quantify what the cost of that is directly, right? Salary, recruiting cost. What's difficult to quantify is the lost opportunity, right? That person didn't take that business and take it in the direction that you needed it to go. And so the opportunity cost is really hard to get your hands on. The benefits of even a modest acceleration, the benefits of even a modest reduction in failure rates are so high that the ROI is kind of like a non-issue, right? So even though it is difficult to measure, when people go through the program and see what the impact is, I never have anyone say, gee, that wasn't worth it, right? It's more like, why didn't we do this earlier, right? And wow, why aren't we, doing this everywhere? So it's a difficult question, Terrence, and it doesn't have an easy answer, right? From a measurement point of view, it's a complex problem. But from a practical point of view, I've never had an issue with anyone, mounting any kind of reasonable challenge about this not being a very important thing to do.
Is there a level within an organization that is most at risk when it comes to a leadership transition?
So this is a great question that really revolves around what are some of the most difficult transitions that people go through during their careers. And I did some research on this, and it's interesting that the transition that people point to that was the most challenging for them was the first time they became a manager, right? Just the process of, stepping up and no longer being a technical specialist, learning to manage through others, right? Is, people point to as a really challenging transition. At more senior levels, it tends to happen when you are either coming into an organization from the outside, in which case you don't understand the culture, you don't understand the network and the politics and how to get things done, or it's a promotion to a level where the skills that made you successful up to that point really don't make you successful going forward. One I focused a lot on is the transition from being a functional leader to being a general manager, right? Where suddenly you're kind of going from being a specialist to a generalist. You've got to set the agenda for the organization. The political dimensions are more complex. You've got to integrate the team as a whole. So moving from being in more of a functional role to really beginning to run, a major cross-functional team, project, initiative, that's probably the biggest point of potential risk where I see people get challenged. And then there's CEOs. They're a special case. But CEOs, it's an extremely difficult challenge, right? To become a CEO for the first time is a very challenging thing.
Emerson is very much a promote from within organization. In fact, up to 80% of our leadership comes from within the organization. So describe for me how the successful leadership transitions could be especially helpful for an organization like ours.
So on one hand, it's a great story because Emerson's a successful organization and you've built a great leadership pipeline, and that's what all of us who are interested in talent management say companies should be doing. So there's an element of this that's absolutely success story. 20% coming in from the outside strikes me as a healthy level of outside blood coming in, right, at different levels. Often in companies like yours, those people come in at a level such that they can kind of get stewed in the culture for a while before they're taking on the really senior leadership positions, and that's a good thing in general. And that's, again, a mark, I think, of a successful company. But the real big implication here is that a lot of transitions are going on internally, right, where people are taking new roles laterally, moving geographically, being promoted. And those are not easy transitions, right? There's nothing easy about, taking a significantly more challenging role internally, right? Unfortunately, there's been a tendency to focus so much attention on onboarding that people miss the point that those internal moves can be as or more challenging than joining the company from the outside. And there tends to be, unfortunately, a tendency not to support those transitions as much, right? It seems kind of obvious that you should help people coming in from the outside to get on board. It's less obvious that you should be doing that internally. And I think the fact that you have a program and are doing this work says something about the culture of the company, right? It says that you don't have a sink or swim culture, right? That you're willing to invest in people making successful moves internally because you recognize that those are really hard. There are lots of companies that don't do that, right? They are sink or swim. I sometimes describe it as leadership development through Darwinian evolution. And we know that that's not a good thing, right? And the outcomes are not good ones.
How do you recommend that someone who is getting ready for the workshop best prepare themselves?
So the core of the workshop is really a kind of process of consolidating, understanding what you're up against, and beginning to put together a plan for, say, the next 90 days, right? That's the essence of what really goes on in this workshop. The more you've begun to think about what you're up against, right? The more you're able to get yourself into a somewhat reflective space so that when you come in, you can engage with your peers and really be thoughtful about what are the challenges you're facing, right? What are the resources that you need or don't have today. The more you're able to do that and be in that reflective state of mind, I think the better. The participants that don't do as well are the ones that are still, it's so much of a churn, right, when they show up in the program that they don't give themselves the opportunity to really step back and say, what's going on here, right? This is a unique opportunity to step back and say, let's look at the big picture here, right? Let's talk about what's really going on. Let's, compare notes about the challenges we're facing. And then let's begin to plan powerfully for how we're going to leave this workshop, and really propel things forward in our organizations.
Michael, sometimes I've sensed that transitions could actually be more difficult for a team or for the business than the transitioning leader, him or herself. Could you speak to that?
Right. If you think about it, if you've got a new leader coming in to an organization, it causes a form of disruption for everybody in that organization, right? They've got to sort of rethink their roles, responsibilities, their future, even in the organization. They've got to adapt to a leader that may have a very different leadership style or set of priorities. And so transitions, yes, are hard on the leader, but they can be very challenging for the whole social system into which the leader is injected. And that's actually not, really recognized, I think, as much as it should be. How enthusiastic should you be, right? You don't want to create the impression that you're there just trying to curry favor, but you better not stay back too far, right? There's real challenges associated with being on the receiving end of a transition rather than being the protagonist.
One of the key takeaways for me personally when I attended the workshop was the concept of securing early wins. What does that accomplish for the transitioning leader, her or his team, and their bosses?
So securing early wins is a way to create momentum. And I think to understand why that's important, you need to understand that transitions are all about momentum, right? What's going on early is people are trying to understand who the leader is, what do they represent, right? Are they going to get excited and on board? Is this leader going to be effective or not? So there's a very important piece of this that is about perception and about engagement and mobilization. And so the big benefit of having some early wins is they are tangible markers that progress is being made, right? That the new leader's approach is beginning to have an impact on the organization. If too long goes without anything seeming to change, people are like, where is this leader, right? What impact are they having? Now, that being said, you have to be very careful as you select where you're going to focus on getting early wins. You don't want them to be trivial, right? They've got to be challenging enough, but they can't be too big that, such that you can't have an impact in a reasonable period of time. You've got to be careful about taking on too many things that are just about kind of low-hanging fruit that don't contribute to the bigger process of taking the organization where you want it to go. The ideal early win initiative is one that creates some progress and a sense of momentum, but also helps lay the foundation for the bigger goals you're trying to accomplish in the organization.
There have been a number of executives who have been going through the workshop. They're not in a transition. One of the really unexpected benefits we found is they're coming up to me saying, oh my gosh, this is my next 90 days. So what I found is whether it's the first 90 days or their next 90 days, the same concepts and principles apply. Could you speak more to that?
So the workshop is really about understanding where you are and planning for going forward. That's most valuable often when you're in transition, but it can be valuable anytime, right? The discipline of taking stock of where you are, right? Understanding the key features of the challenges you're facing, thinking about what you need to learn, because we need to learn these days at every point in time, and putting together a plan for the next 90 days, that can be an incredibly productive thing to do. I've had leaders go through the first 90 days program and adopt it as a methodology for every 90 days. They go forward and do this sort of work. As the speed of change is accelerated, you can argue that senior leaders are basically in transition in some form or another almost always, right? And if that's the case, then the discipline of understanding, diagnosing, learning, planning, connecting, propelling things forward, that can be a very useful discipline wherever you are in terms of timing in your role.
The Successful Leadership Transition Workshop is very different than other types of leadership development programs that many of our employees have gone through. In those, you learn a skill, you practice a skill, you role play it. But here, people leave with a detailed plan. I've described it to people that you're not really here to attend a workshop. You're really here to learn and implement an operating system for how you manage and lead in a transition. Could you speak toward that?
Successful leadership transitions is different than most other forms of leadership development, because in part it's keyed to a particular time, right? A time where someone is going through a transition. It's not a general set of skills, maybe I need them, maybe I don't, isn't that interesting, maybe it's not. It's very visceral, right? You are the case study. You are the person who is in motion from one place to another. The whole purpose of successful leadership transitions is to help you along that road, right? So the notion of an operating system, I think, is very powerful, right? It's a way of thinking. It's a way of understanding. It's a way of planning. It's a way of mobilizing that can really help you through those times. And that's why also, by the way, that discipline, right, that approach can be so helpful at almost any point in time, because it is an operating system and not just a set of skills that you may or may not need to exercise.
Michael, we really believe that the Successful Leadership Transitions Workshop is key to our success in equipping and preparing our current and emerging leaders to succeed anytime they come into a new leadership role. So we appreciate the opportunity to partner with you and to offer the Successful Leadership Transitions Workshop. So thank you very much, and thanks for your time with us today.